And with everything else I've been doing around Tomb of Sargeras and will be continuing to do, I've sort of realised, actually, I haven't done a good old-fashioned Retribution Paladin vlog for a little while, and now is a very good time to do it. I'm getting a lot of people asking where are Rets at the moment in terms of the Tomb of Sargeras. Obviously, we're on this sort of precipice. It's almost like at any time we sort of think we're going to get some tuning. You know, other classes have had it since the launch of Tomb of Sargeras. We sort of feel we really need it. And it's like, you know, every Friday it's like, oh, it's coming, they're going to announce something. Oh no, they're talking about Feral Druids in 7.3, which is months away. Great. But a couple of notices. First of all, I am very much minded to be talking about Retribution Paladins at the moment, because a couple of big discussions going to go on. This weekend is the turn on Final Boss TV for the Retribution Paladin discussions. So I'm going to be featuring on that along with Branderps, who was the Retribution Paladin you may have been watching streaming as his guild, the Big Dumb Guild, raced to world number 1 in terms of 5 out of 9 on that first day of Mythic Progress. And that's going to be Sunday. I suppose it depends where you are in Europe. It's around about evening time, quite late on-ish. And in America, it's sort of afternoon to early evening. And also next weekend, I'm going to be doing my usual live Ret Q&As. So these are things that I do every now and then. It's roundabout time to do it now. Obviously, it doesn't make sense to do it this weekend. So I'm going to do that next weekend as well. That's going to be next Saturday, the 15th at 7 PM UK time. So I can be very definite about the time on that one. Follow me on Twitter for updates on all the various things there. So in terms of where we are with Tomb of Sargeras, I had a bit of a decision in terms of where I wanted my focus to be for this one. Because you can talk about Mythic, you can talk about Heroic, you can talk about the others as well, Normal and LFR. I'm mostly going to try, I sort of narrowed it down, I should either talk about Retribution Paladins as they are in Mythic or as they are in Heroic. And you could sort of say to yourself, you know, why aren't the issues the same in both? They're not quite the same in both. Obviously, as a Mythic Raider, I am naturally more inclined to be talking about our issues in Mythic, but I'm also minded of the fact that we're a much smaller pool of players than, say, the people progressing through Heroic. Yes, there are people who will be progressing in Normal as well, but generally speaking, if you're in an organised guild and you have an organised raid team, your aim is not to finish Normal, it's to finish Normal and go on to Heroic. You're aiming for ahead of the curve, and if you're a Mythic raid, you're aiming for cutting edge, of course. Those are the two hallmarks of excellence within raiding in World of Warcraft. And in the end, I've sort of decided to go along the lines of Heroic. Now, they are different because in Mythic raiding, it's expected that people know how to play their class. The difficulty is in dealing with specific mechanics, which, of course, change. And it can be that you're really good on a fight in Heroic as a particular class and spec, and then the nature of the Mythic tactics you have to use mean that actually now you're not so good after all. But I've decided to focus on Heroic because it's much less of an issue for people if you play a particular class or spec, because anything can be taken wrong, not only due to the flex nature of it, but due to the fact that player skill accounts for much more. In a lot of Heroic raiding guilds, you have good players, but you also have not so good players. So you have a good player of a particular spec, even if it's plumb down at the bottom of the tables, they can still be the best DPS in your raid. Just because they play a lot better than someone who's playing a better spec, but not as well. If that makes sense. Now, the other thing is I'm going to be looking, as you can see here, at some logs. This one is for overall Mythic Tomb of Sargeras. And you can see we're quite low down at the bottom. Now, it is worth just pointing a few things out here, and Blizzard would say this as well, and they're quite correct in many ways. You can't always read too much into these. There are several things that can skew them. First of all, AoE-based fights are going to, like, more heavily weight it in a way, I suppose, because you're going to be able to produce much larger numbers. But also, as Blizzard note, especially for pure DPS classes or classes that have more than one spec to do DPS, is you get a higher proportion of good players who play what is the best spec. So, for example, if we look on this chart, we can see Affliction is way ahead of Destruction and Demonology. Now, I don't know a lot about Warlocks. I tend not to associate with the known playing races and classes. However, what is certainly potentially true, let's say Affliction was a bit better. At the moment, it looks like it's way better, but let's say it's a bit better. All the good players are going to play Affliction because it's the best spec, even if it's the best by a few %. And then the not so good players may not get on with Affliction. They may not enjoy it. And of course, there's nothing wrong at a certain level in playing the spec you most enjoy. Some people may not get on with it. They may not be able to play it or understand the subtleties of it. So they play an easier spec, one where it's easier to do okay. So that creates a situation potentially, I'm not saying this is the case here, but potentially where the best players are playing Affliction and the not so good players are playing the other two specs. And the gap between them is much larger than it really is just because you've got the better players playing a particular spec. So we have to watch out for things like that. That being said, Blizzard like to dismiss these things altogether, and I don't think that is valid, because although, yeah, you can have people who pad, and Retribution Paladins are actually really good at padding, if they're minded to do so, but nonetheless, I think it's probably safe to say that for any given class or spec, you've got equal numbers of people who will do the mechanics properly and pad, because they don't care about doing mechanics, they just want to increase their numbers. So I think it is fair to look at these to a certain extent. So we're going to go from Mythic to Heroic here. So we can see Heroic, it's actually pretty much the same picture. Quite low down there at the bottom. And it's not just an order as well. You can look at position and say, well, someone has to be last. As long as they're really close together, that's okay. But you can see they're not really close together. So then what we should do is look at individual fights. Again, if this is skewed because of one particular fight that's really bad for us, but let's say it's one of the initial fights where it doesn't really matter, then it's okay. And we can look at Gorath here. So at Gorath, we're right down there, just above Frost DKs and underneath Fire Mages, for goodness sake. Now, this is a classic case of one that doesn't matter, because it's the first boss. It doesn't matter what you take, you will kill it. But what we can see here is, or start to see, because this is the first one, we can think, what is Gorath? It's a single target fight with a fair amount of movement. Okay, think about the movement. You have got, if you get Crashing Comet, you need to make sure that you're not stood on anyone else. So you need to move out. That might mean moving out of melee range if there's a lot of melee in that group. And that means taking DPS off. If you've got wings up at the time, a single second when you're not using a DPS ability as a Ret is ruinous. During wings is calamitous. And that can easily happen because these abilities happen all the time. So that's one. Then you get what's it called? Shattering Star. One with the big green arrow on you. You're definitely moving out there. That is you shifting your ass out of it. So that is going to mean a lot of DPS lost as well. And again, because we're not that fast, getting back there is not necessarily easy. Of course, you can take... well, you've got your Divine Steed. You could take Cavalier and get 2 of them. Maybe not so bad then. But again, and it could be a bit of RNG. But the RNG is there for everyone in terms of whether they'd have to move out or not. Then you've got Burning Doofer, where you've got to stand behind one of the spikes. Burning Doofer is what it's called now, by the way. And you no DPS then unless it's right by the boss. Sometimes it's right by the boss. Now, of course, everyone else is taking DPS off at that time, of course. But remember how much we suffer. Like some classes, if they've got to build up a resource anyway, so they can, you know, energy-based classes especially can burn, spend. Then if they have to move out for a few seconds, that's they can build it back up and then go back in. Yes, they still don't like doing that, but it's not as ruinous as someone that's got... There are abilities... are on a time-based thing, really. Our holy power builders are time-based, not resource-based, and it's our spenders that are resource-based that we build up with the time. So we absolutely have to be spanning. So at the moment, it's looking like single target, especially with movement, not looking good for us. Then we look at Demonic Inquisition. Same story, right at the bottom. What is it? Largely single target. Yes, you can do a bit of 2-target cleave at the start. That's fine. But you don't ideally spec for 2-target cleave, because after that, it's very likely the 2 bosses are not going to be near each other. Because you must not be doing any damage to Balek while Fell Squall is up. Sorry, my voice is going there. And you must not be doing any damage to Atragon when Bone Sword, I'm trying to get the names right here, it is up as well. And although there's plenty of periods of time when neither is up, and in theory you can group them up in an AoE, it's a bit dodgy. You're better off generally separating them after that first initial Fell Squall. So it's effectively single target, is what I'm basically saying there. And although it's not a particularly high movement fight, because as long as they're not miles away, these 2 bosses, you can easily switch from one to the other and back again without losing too much damage. Nonetheless, single target fight, again, not looking ideal. These, by the way, are, as you'll notice, they're just the standard settings on from Warcraft log statistics, which is the 75th percentile. I've tended to stick that because one argument you could say, and there's a lot of heroic, there'll be a lot of players who don't know how to play their class well. This sort of, I mean, 75th percentile, you're taking that at the top 25%. So generally speaking, we can say that the people who are playing these classes and specs know what they're doing to a reasonable extent. So then we go to Hodjatan, and we can see this is looking much better. It's much more middling now. This, of course, is because there's AoE on there, and our AoE is actually fine. And this is where one of the difficulties comes. Single target, not so fine. AoE is fine. So then we look at a situation where it's not a simple case of just buffing our abilities, because we can't put ourselves in a situation where AoE is too good. But of course, you know, you say here, well, it's not like we're at the top here. I mean, come on, we can stand to be buffed even in AoE, surely. Potentially. Of course, we could go down then to Mistress Assassin, and we can see we're much higher up. Much more AoE there, because the ads tend to last a lot longer. Hodjatan, the Murlocs are supposed to die really quickly. On Mistress Assassin, you actually don't want to kill the ads really quickly, because if you do, the puddles may spawn and then despawn before the tornadoes come in. So we can benefit from this by doing a lot more AoE, so it's much higher up. At the same time, it's still a long way off from the very best AoEers. But the argument could then be, well, maybe, you know, if we're good at AoE and we're okay on single target, maybe that covers it, and the ones who are really good at AoE maybe are bad at single target. But as we've seen from the fight so far, we're not actually good on single target either. We're not good at all. So then we move to the next boss, Sisters of the Moon. Again, it's a roundabout middling, because although in position terms you can look at this, you can say it's actually a bit below middling there. There's a whole gaggle of bars we can see on that chart there that are very, very close to each other. We just happen to be at the bottom of it. So there's not a lot of difference between, say, us and Affliction Warlocks on that fight, and they're several places higher. So that's fairly interchangeable. But again, it's still not one of the best on that fight. Again, a single target fight. For melee, it's not a massive amount of movement, so we can't really say this is a high movement fight. There's a little period where there's some 2-target cleave as well. So in theory, it shouldn't be a terrible fight for us, but again, it's not looking great. So then you look at here, okay, so this is this is like Demonic Inquisition, surely. Single target fight, not that much movement, but a little bit of 2-target cleave for a small portion of the fight, but for most of it single target. What's the deal? Why are we so low on Demonic Inquisition, so high up on Sisters? The answer can be potential, or not. In one of these things, they always say there isn't one simple answer, but there's a fairly good indicator in that Sisters of the Moon is a little bit more deadly as a boss fight, so more people die. What happens when people die? We get our Retribution passive procs. So what you can see when you sort of look at some of these logs, you can see that people have got Retribution passive going. That, of course, is a fairly significant DPS buff for us. Now, Blizzard would say that it's not a big deal. They haven't recently conceded that maybe it's a bigger deal than they originally thought it was, and maybe should be toned down a bit. I think they should get rid of the DPS bonus altogether and just tune the rest of our abilities around it, because in fights where people are dying a lot, we tend to look a little bit better. And we're still not looking brilliant there. So then we can move down to the Desolate House. There's a lot of AoE on this one, so it should be good, right? Apparently not. It's not looking great at all. And this is another one where you look at it, it's not a lot of movement. Towards the end, okay, you have to keep moving out, but so does everyone else. Not a lot of movement. So then you think to yourself, is it because people tend not to die as much on this one? Because that Retribution passive, as I say, I think is a real big problem. But it did surprise me, this one, a little bit, because I thought there is potential for some good cleave on this fight. But that doesn't seem to really matter. And you can look at the ones who are right at the top. So Balanced Druids there, they're good at AoE, of course. But then like Subtlety Rogues, Arms Warriors are very good at cleave as well. Should we be so far behind compared to, say, Arms Warriors on that? They get Execute, of course, which is very important because the last portion of the fight has a number of things that you can be attacking on low health. But I just intuitively don't think we should be as far behind on Desolate Host. So that's a bit of an aberration for me. But then we go to Maiden of Vigilance. This doesn't surprise me at all, again, right at the bottom. In theory, Maiden of Vigilance could be a reasonable one, because the movement is not that much apart from when you're moving from one side of the platform to the other. And in theory, you could line up cooldowns with getting the orb buffs, but you'd have to time it very carefully, and you'd have to be at the boss. Now, most guilds are likely to do it in the same way we do, is that melee stand back just to make sure we don't soak the wrong orbs, and while range are still attacking the Maiden, we move side to side playing Guitar Hero, picking up the right colour orbs. So at that point, we're not doing any damage. And then when you get into the boss at that point, the orb buff doesn't last very long. So it doesn't really last long enough to build Crusade up. Now, if you could be stood at the boss and collecting the right orbs as they come in, you could be building up your Crusade stacks so that when you've got your ideally 10 stacks of the buff, you could then be unloading hell upon that boss. Unfortunately, as I say, it doesn't work out like that for our guild, and we don't do it like that for a lot of other guilds as well. So that's potentially where that one goes wrong. So you just have to treat it normally. You might as well just hero on the pull, sorry, Crusade on the pull, and do it as a normal single target boss fight again. And although there's not, like, there's some movement if you have to go into the hole, that's a bit of movement, but that's the same for everyone. That's just an RNG thing. Unless you're cocking the fight up, then you don't get a bomb unless it's RNG, and that can happen equally to anyone. So again, for me, it's a single target boss fight where at least for other melee we should be on par for it. If our single target was okay, and it's not, really. It's quite low down. Then we get on to Final Avatar, and again, this will surprise no one because this is a massively heavy movement fight. It's also single target. Now, this is when I said before about Rets having the potential to pad. Well, this is your potential to pad, isn't it? Because you could just be divining Storm through the boss and the Maiden at all times, which is not good, of course, because that means you might not get an extra use of the Maiden to get the boss's health down for P2 a bit more. So you shouldn't. You should be single targeting purely on this fight. And that's what majority you would think would do. So we're treating it as a single target fight with the occasional swap, but a hell of a lot of movement. So there's loads of things to move from. Shadow Blades, whether you, are they called Shadow Blades? The daggers, the big purple daggers. If you get them on you, obviously you're going to have to do some movement. If you don't get them on you, you still may have to move, depending on where they're pointing. You have the ability where you've got to sort of run right out. I know on Heroic, if you're above a certain level of gear, you can probably move out a little bit and take it. It's not likely to kill you. But if we're sort of assuming that most people are going to play the tactics properly, especially if they don't necessarily have the stamina to be able to withstand these abilities after all are designed to kill you if you don't deal with them, then that means you're having to move out and then run back in, and that's a lot of lost DPS time. And then, of course, as I said, you've got, I completely forgotten the abilities on the Avatar, just know what they look like, where you spawn 4 green circles. And what we do, we are very melee heavy in our heroic group, or in indeed any group. We've got loads of melee. And so we basically move back. Now, what would be ideal is if you had your own little zone as a melee, and you could sort of move back to the side, forward again, and stuff like that. And you could basically go around a little circle and stay within melee range of the boss and not have to take DPS off at all, because the hitbox is a decent size. But we're so melee heavy, we can't reliably do that. We just end up with people dead. So we just basically have to move back. Just run back and then back in again. So lost movement there as well. Moving to soak is not such an issue because you should be able to do that without moving out of melee range, although occasionally it depends where they spawn. If melee are required, because melee heavy, to go out of melee range to soak, then that's what we're going to have to do as well. So massively disadvantageous to us there. To all melee, of course, it's disadvantageous because I'm having to take DPS off. But like I said before, we have a time-based rotation, so we're having to hit something every second, whereas I'm not saying all, but some others, as I say, have a resource that they can spend before they have to run out, and then it can build up a little bit before they go back in. They don't lose as much. Okay, now the final one, Kiljaeden, actually looking good. In fact, Kiljaeden is our best one. So what's the story here? Well, there's a couple of things here. First of all, there's an intense bit of cleave where you've got the reflections that appear, and those reflections can be timed with crusade stacks. You can build up, depends how quickly you phase the boss, because there's a certain amount of, some of it's time based, but some of it is very much percentage based. So if you push the boss a little quicker, as we did this week, crusade doesn't line up as brilliantly, but generally speaking, we can make sure that when the reflections spawn, we're on full stacks of crusade, and we can AoE the hell out of them. Obviously, we're still going to finish a distant second to an arms warrior, but nonetheless, we can still do decent AoE there. That's obviously going to increase those overall numbers. There's a bit of a stacking going on with the elemental type guys when we get Illidan's Sight, so if people can grip and stack those up, then of course we can get some good AoE going there. But the rest of it is single target, but it's an odd single target bit in that there's large portions of the fight where you can't do damage at all in like that, the first phase, because Kiljaeden, well, second phase I suppose you'd call it, disappears off, unattackable, can't do anything to him. You're just going around soaking, moving towards orbs and stuff like that. That's actually quite useful for us, because what it means is that we have a much smaller proportion of the fight spent outside of crusade, because that no one's doing any damage at that point. So our uptime on crusade, in terms of effective uptime, is higher than it is on most other fights. because we use Crusade at the start, close to the start, and that's on cooldown. Then he jumps up into the air, so that by the time he comes back down again, you've got it. You've had it ready for a while, to be fair, but you've got it ready again. So again, you've got that higher proportion on Crusade, and so much of our damage happens during Crusade as well. So that helps us. The other thing that helps us, of course, is no getting away from it. People die on Kiljaeden. I died this week, actually. That was quite bad. But people die on Kiljaeden. And when people die, if it's a fight where you are going to get a few people dying throughout the fight, and especially if it lines up with wings, but you can't count on that, of course, then you are going to be having more damage done because of the Retribution passive again. So that's a look at some of the fights and where we are with this. So as an overall summary, what I would say is what we're seeing from this, and again, yes, we can't read too much into it. I fully understand that there's certain assumptions that can easily be made if you're looking at these things. But nonetheless, in general, we seem okay on AoE. I wouldn't say amazing, but we are okay. There's no real issue with that. But where we do fall down is single target. We also fall down with anything to do with movement. Now, Blizzard have said before that they see, say, movement and defensives as like an overall package. If you're not so good at movement, having been better at being defensive helps you out, and vice versa. I don't agree. There's plenty of fights where they're very, very dangerous, and the fact that we have like Bubble and, well, Shield of Vengeance, we tend to use aggressively. But certainly Bubble, whether you've got it on Divine Intervention or just manually used, can help us, even though they're basically nerfing it on a lot of abilities. There's plenty of abilities with these recent hotfixes Bubble will not work with, so that nerfs us effectively. And so, yeah, on those sort of fights, we can maybe do better. But on those sort of fights, is movement going to help the people who are better at movement? No. Because if what kills you is something that targets you, not a circle that appears, then that's not helping the people with more movement either. And vice versa. If you've got a situation where, like on Avatar, movement's really important, is being more defensive better? Sure. One of the abilities that we'd have to move out for, we can just bubble. Great. Then that bubble's on a long cooldown, so we can't then use it the next time it happens, or the next time, or the time after that. We have to wait for quite long into the fight to use it again. So it still doesn't help us. So I don't think Blizzard should consider the two. You know, I think they should treat movement and defensives as two separate things, really. And maybe bring some less defensive specs up to the same as some others. And, you know, same with movement for those. But in terms of other main issues we have, one thing that is noticeable is that a lot of us, myself included, are gathering more mastery than we've been in the past. My mastery, just in this few weeks of Tomb of Sargeras, has gone up 50%. I've gone from less than 20% mastery. It's actually more than 50% because it's a bit more than 30% mastery I have at the moment. Now, first thing, I need to come at this from both angles. People keep sort of say, oh, mastery is bad, avoid mastery at all costs. It's not bad. All of our stats, both primary and secondary, are good. Strength, crit, haste, versatility and mastery are all good for us. They're actually quite close in value. However, mastery does lag noticeably behind, not significantly, noticeably behind. If you leave it behind, let's say you're in a position, because maybe you're on a character where at your item level you can actually get yourself a load of crafted gear, and that's actually better than the stuff that's dropping for you. You can, of course, avoid mastery completely. Now, if you do that and you sim your stat weights, you will find that mastery looks quite tasty. The reason is if you leave any stat behind with Retribution Paladins, because they're so close, they actually increase, anything left behind increases in value. That can include mastery. But realistically, with the amount of mastery we're getting from Tomb of Sargeras gear, we're not going to be in that position. Now, Sol Sacra, for those who watch my videos don't know who he is, or if you're part of the community, but he is basically our main standard bearer as a Retribution Paladin. He is one of the senior theory crafters involved with Simcraft and other projects like that for Ret Paladins. He was playing about with a few numbers today, which I hope he won't mind me sharing with you. He compared a haste crit ring with a haste mastery ring, okay? And what he found was, if you have a 9-10 haste crit ring, which would be very nice, thank you very much, and then you had a haste mastery ring, for that haste mastery ring to be about the same DPS, it would have to be 940 item level, 30 item levels before. Now remember, we've had issues with rings and necks from the start of Legion. Blizzard tried to retune them so that, because the issue is, like, for someone who doesn't sim themselves or sim the stat weights, How do you know what's an upgrade? Just going by item level doesn't tell you the full story. And there was a huge disparity, especially with rings and necks. So they tried to close it down. And what Blizzard said is they want the situation where 10 item levels upgrade is a definite upgrade. If this thing is 10 item levels above what you've currently got, you're wearing it because it's definitely an upgrade. Not including set bonuses and stuff like that, but just in terms of pure stat gear. This is not the case here. 30 item levels higher it needs to be. And that's for it to be about the same. In fact, you can see from these numbers, it's actually just slightly under. But it's about the same. And that's appalling. So that basically means anything with mastery on it is poison. Especially for a ring or a neck where you have such high secondary stat budgets on them because there's no primary stats on them. Then, and this is where you start to think to yourself, so what's the solution? The solution seems fairly straightforward. What he did was to basically say, okay, so let's say we got 40% more benefit from our mastery. Okay? So in other words, in a certain mastery rating, say 1,000 mastery, something like that, was going to be worth 40% more in terms of percentage terms than it is compared to now. And found out that then you could basically have it roughly the same. So if you increase mastery by about 40%, that's what you need to do to bring mastery in line with the rest of the stuff. So if they did that, if they made that change, mastery would not be, as I say poisonous. I say it is a bit harsh because it's not far behind the others, but it is behind the others. To the point where you ideally don't want much mastery on your gear. You want some. Because I say if you don't have any, so it falls behind, it's going to increase in value. And it's one of these things, and you think to yourself, so why isn't this change been made? If that would solve a particular problem. And that may solve much of our problems, as I say, in terms of the single target AoE. Because remember, our AoE, although our AoE is clearly looking better than a single target, we are not romping on any of the fights in Tomb of Sargeras. When you look at the logs. And believe you me, there are plenty of DPS whoring Ret Paladins out there who will make advantages out of any ability to cleave or AoE, even when they're not supposed to. The same for any other class and spec. So we're not getting done over by that. So for AoE and single target, we're never more than slightly ahead of the middle of the pack, and quite often quite low down. And as I say, Blizzard can look at this as much as they like and say, okay, well, you can't read this into logs because of this, and you can't read that into that. We know that there is an issue around single target DPS, at least. The only times when we do well on single target, and we do well on some single target fights, you may know yourself. You may look at these logs and say, oh, well, actually, but on that fight, it says I'm bottom there, but on that fight, I'm actually one of the best in our guild. And it could just be that you are one of the best in your guild, but it could just be people in your guild are dying and you're benefiting from that retribution passive. Because think about it this way. If you get someone die when you've got full stacks of Crusade and another 20 seconds to go on your Crusade, that's the dream. What have you got? You've got a 20% DPS increase. What's that like? That is twice the Chain of Thrain. Our Abyss Legendary, the Retribution passive proc happening at that time, is worth double. That's putting it into context. That's how powerful that passive is. So, to my mind, they should basically increase the value of mastery for us. They should also completely remove the damage bonus of the Retribution passive and then retune our abilities. But one thing I know they're wanting to do, I don't think they're going to do any of those two things. And one of the reasons why I think we're not hearing anything, because I think tuning is in mind, and it's something they said in the AMA, and they've sort of made it known, where they see a key problem is with our Crusade. So what they're wanting to do is nerf our Crusade, and then they said significantly buff the rest of our abilities. Now, I've said this before, that sounds fine in practice. In reality, there is a danger. In Alpha and Beta, they tried to do this. I mean, I know during Legion, they have also nerfed our Crusade slightly, but we're still using it as the go-to talent there. But when they did it in Alpha and Legion, where they were free to sort of change it, you know, do lots of mad things, they ended up actually making it, nerfing it to the point where it was worse than useless. Literally, it was like, you are better off not having a talent at all in that row than taking Crusade. It was of negative value. And that's an issue with it. That it's not a simple case of, okay, it's 3% at the moment, maybe we nerf it down to 2.5% or blah, blah, blah. You get to a point where it's Crusade's the best talent to take, Crusade's the best talent to take, Crusade's the best talent to take. Crusade is poison, it's toxic, you're better off having no talent than taking that. And that's the issue. And the thing is, when they did it in alpha and beta, it was a bit like facepalm moment. If they do it now and get it wrong, it's live. We're screwed live. And that is a big issue. And that may well be why, and they're, because that's stupid, they're fully seized of this, I'm sure, why we're not hearing anything. Because obviously a number of specs got tuning quite early on, like when Mythic Tomb of Sargeras was coming out. And you know, we have been waiting as Ret Paladins for our tuning, and it's not come and it's not come. And it could well be that Blizzard are trying to do it in this particular way, which in my opinion is not necessarily the best way to do it now. I would look at Crusade again for the next expansion, not for now. But that's the way I think they want to go with it, and they're fully seized of the fact that they could get it very, very wrong, and they really don't want to do that. And maybe that's why nothing's been said. But anyway, probably quite a long one there. I haven't actually looked at the time, how long I've been waffling on there. But it's been a while since I had a good old-fashioned, as I say, Retribution Paladin vlog. So there we go. Maybe I should do a few more of these. But there will be, as I say, plenty of discussion to come, because Final Boss this weekend, my live Rec Q&A next weekend, and I'm always on up for chatting about whatever on most of my sort of streams. I'm going to be streaming, as it happens, in a couple of hours on the Saturday at 3 PM UK time. General gameplay stream, but that's going to be on the PTR for Argus. So if you don't want to, if you want to stay away from any Argus spoilers, you probably should stay away from there. But I'm happy to talk about whatever in those sort of streams as well. So follow me on Twitter to find out about those. Follow me on Twitch as well if you want to know when I sometimes just randomly stream without actually advertising it. And I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, don't forget to subscribe for further content. And until next time, I'll see you later.